Object Memory Park is not supposed to have a name. Parks get names, zones get codes. Strange feelings people have on benches stay in gossip, not in state archives. And yet there is a file in front of me that insists, in plain typed letters, Object Memory Park, locality associated with reports of non-subjective recollection. Underneath, in smaller handwriting, someone has added a version that sounds more like what they were actually afraid of. The Soviet zone where visitors remember lives that are not theirs. According to the summary attached to the cover, a remote lab once recorded a fading signal linked to visitors who reported memories that did not belong to them. An anomaly formed across comparative recollection logs, followed by unusual reactions in monitoring posts. Moments later, a shift in final reports was quietly noted by the KGB unit assigned to the site, and then removed from normal circulation. That is the public-facing face of this folder. That version hints at some vague psychological oddity, perhaps a mass suggestion or a shared dream. Harmless, if you phrase it like that. The rest of the file does its best to sound like that too. It keeps reaching for words like contamination, projection, stress. Anything but what witnesses kept insisting on. I remember things I never lived. The first thing that stands out is where Object Memory Park is not. It is not in the middle of a city, not a grand civic park with statues and obvious history. It is a strip of planned greenery on the edge of an industrial settlement that never grew as large as the planners expected. The map code is dull. A number, a letter, a grid square. On an aerial photograph from the period, it looks like an afterthought. A rectangular patch of darker gray between low concrete blocks and a small river that only matters during the thaw. Before the labs came, they called it simply the park behind the factory. A few birch trees, a scattering of benches, a fenced-off playground. Enough to tick a box in some central office that demanded recreational spaces for workers and their families. The benches face a narrow asphalt path that loops around a low rise with a cracked monument at the top. The monument is not described in detail in the file. It is always the stone, as if everyone agreed not to dignify it with more. What changed was not the park, but what moved in beneath it. When industrial facilities are built in inconvenient places, there is always a question of what else might be hidden nearby. Storage bunkers, communication nodes, testing rooms that do not look like much from above. In this case, beneath the unremarkable park there was a modest underground complex, a repurposed civil defense shelter and a handful of low rooms linked to the local research institute. Officially, those rooms housed memory and cognition studies on conscripts and civilian volunteers. Unofficially, they were a convenient place to run experiments on how people handled stress, trauma, and fear. The early part of the file reads like any other attempt to quantify the human mind under pressure. There are lists of test subjects, all identified by initials. There are protocols for controlled sleep deprivation, for repeated exposure to disturbing images, for recall exercises after simulated emergencies. It is ugly, but it is ordinary for the time. The word park appears at first only as a geographic label. Subject A relocated from barracks to park bench number 3. Post-session cool-down walk conducted in park perimeter. The idea was simple. After each experimental session in the underground rooms, subjects were escorted up through a side stairwell and allowed to sit in the open air for a fixed period, supposedly to reintegrate and lower their heart rate. Doctors took notes. Guards smoked nearby and pretended not to listen. The first mention of something out of place is a throwaway line in one of those notes. Subject F, after session 4, sat on bench 2, facing the monument. After 10 minutes of silence, he began describing, unprompted, a childhood home by a warm sea. States it is his grandmother's house. On follow-up, Subject F has never been south of Ural region and has no known family near any sea. Belief in described memory appears sincere. The psychologist underlined sincere and added, in the margin, fantasy, escape, monitor. A few pages later, a similar note appears, this time for a different subject. Subject L, after session 2, seated on bench 1 nearest playground. Reports sudden recollection of being around 8 years old, stuck in a lift between floors with 4 strangers. Panic, smell of oil and metal, hot air. Subject is claustrophobic, but no prior records of such an incident. When asked to draw the lift interior, includes manufacturer's logo inconsistent with local models. The initial assumption, the only one that fits usual doctrine, is that the stress of the experiments is causing confabulation, false memories built out of scraps of stories and images. People under pressure say strange things. They borrow lives from films and books. That is why psychiatric categories exist. But patterns have a way of building up in margins, long before someone admits there is a pattern. Over weeks, different subjects, seated on different benches at different times of day, begin mentioning experiences that cannot be reconciled with their own biographies. A man who has spent his whole life in the north describes in detail the taste of ripe figs eaten from a market stall in a dusty street. A teenager who has never left his home district recounts a night shift on a fishing trawler in rough seas, pressing his feet against a deck that rolls under him, with a rhythm his body recognizes too well to be guessed. A woman who has never married starts crying quietly on bench 4, as she relives in precise sensory detail, giving birth in a small rural clinic, describing the position of the cracked tiles on the ceiling. The file's authors try for a while to treat these as metaphors, as displaced symbols for whatever the experiments are actually stirring up. They run additional tests, ink blots, word association, more detailed life histories. They look for literature, films, songs that might have seeded these images. They ask leading questions and get resistance, or confusion, or indifference. One note, from a psychologist who has the patience to write in full sentences, stands out. Subjects demonstrate the usual suggestibility when discussing their own pasts. Memories bend readily under pressure. But descriptions of the new experiences occurring in park show less malleability. Attempts to reinterpret them as dreams or fantasies meet with unusually firm insistence. No, that is how it was. By itself, that might still not have been enough to justify a label like Object Memory Park. People lie, and people cling to lies, especially when those lies feel more interesting than their actual lives. What changes the tone of the file is the comparative log. The lab had a habit, bureaucratic and weary, of maintaining recollection tables for each subject. Lists of dates, key events, notable details about family, work, notable experiences. Whenever a subject introduced a new story about their past, it was noted, dated, and occasionally checked against records. It was a way to track consistency and catch fabrications. As the park episodes accumulate, someone in the office begins marking them differently. Instead of adding them to the subject's life column, they are entered into separate columns labeled Park 1, Park 2, and so on. The idea is to keep life and park content distinct for later analysis. There are about 20 such entries when the anomaly shows up. It begins with an annoyed clerk. As of this week, she writes in an internal memo, "I note that entries in park columns for different subjects contain overlapping details that cannot be explained by common environment or media. For example, multiple subjects refer to a river with 3 stone arches in connection with childhood memories, none of which took place in their actual childhood locations, which differ widely. Recommend central review of park recollections for possible contamination between subjects." Contamination is the word they use when subjects swap stories in the barracks, or influence each other in cues, or overhear things they should not. It is accusation, not diagnosis. The KGB local officers copied in, out of habit. He has his own reasons to be wary of anything that looks like a story spreading outside approved channels. The fog of possible contamination should have been enough to explain it all away. But when the central review happens, really just a bored senior psychologist sitting down with a stack of forms and a long evening, something stranger appears. The overlapping details the clerk mentioned are too specific. 3 different men from different units with no known contact outside the lab and no overlapping schedules describe not just a river with 3 stone arches, but a particular way the water sounds under the middle arch in spring, a certain cracked step on the left bank, the smell from a bakery on the corner above. 2 of them name the bread by a local city word none of them actually uses in their normal speech. They do not agree on who they are in that place. One is a 10-year-old boy with scraped knees. Another is a woman in her 30s carrying a sack of flour. A third is an old man leaning on the rail, spitting into the water. But the setting is clearly the same, down to a chipped enamel sign in the background that none of them thinks to mention until prompted. Similarly, 4 different subjects who remember being in a small hospital room describe, without variation, a crack in the wall, plaster shaped like a crooked tree, a loose tile that rocks underfoot near the bed, and a narrow window that only shows the top of a particular chimney. They disagree on what is wrong with them in the bed: appendicitis, pneumonia, a broken leg. Their real medical histories show none of these hospitalizations. The comparative table fills up with red ink and question marks. There is, at this point, a plausible secular explanation. These are generic features of understaffed institutions across a vast country. Tiles crack. Chimneys crowd skylines. Bridges come in sets of 3. People share a common visual vocabulary even if they have never met. They are projecting. But some details are harder to fold into that comfort. One subject insists that in his hospital memory, the nurse hums a specific melody while changing a bandage. He cannot name it, only reproduce it poorly. It is noted and set aside. Weeks later, another subject, on a different bench, talking about a different hospital visit in the same park memory, begins absent-mindedly humming the same tune before the interviewer prompts for any detail. When asked later, neither can recall ever hearing it anywhere else. The lab's own monitoring posts, the people whose job it is to watch subjects for signs of collusion, begin to show unusual reactions in their own logs. Guards and orderlies assigned regularly to escort duties through the park start to remember. small fragments of places they have never been. Not complete episodes, not like the full narrative subject report, but flashes. The exact sensation of sitting in a cinema seat that creaks in a particular way under someone else's weight. The view from the top of an apartment building whose stairwell they can navigate in their heads but have never physically entered. A pattern suggests itself and then refuses to be dismissed. The simplest way to phrase it is this: people spending time in that park, especially after undergoing certain experiments underground, begin to recall scenes that seem to belong to other lives. And some of those scenes match across different people as if they were all dipping into the same pool. You can see why the KGB, who are trained to suspect invisible pools of information shared outside authorized channels, would take an interest. The file thickens around this point. Interviews become more detailed. The tone sharpens. Words like ideological contamination and unauthorized inner emigration appear. Old fears hammered into new shapes. Before any of that, though, there is one more small, unassuming entry that the later authors do not quite know what to do with. It is a report from a maintenance worker. There is a bench closest to the monument that is always slightly warm, he writes, even in winter when the others hold frost. I have replaced it twice due to rot and wear. After a few weeks, it acquires the same quality. Colleagues joke that this is because people sit only there, but usage is uniform. Temperature readings with simple thermometers show no difference, but when you put your hand on it, it feels as if someone just rose from it. He adds, almost as an apology, maybe I am imagining it, but when I sit there, I get a sense that I have been here before on a different day, with different clothes, watching different people. That bench becomes in later testimony a focus point. They label it Bench Alpha on diagrams. They begin to assign subjects to it deliberately, to see whether it works differently. The record of those bench-specific experiments is incomplete. Several pages are missing. What survives suggests the effect strengthened. Subjects seated on Bench Alpha, after sessions not involving overt distress, after calm cognitive tasks or neutral interviews, began reporting park memories anyway. The underground work became less of a trigger and more of a pretext. One subject, never previously prone to these episodes, sits on the bench, falls quiet for almost 20 minutes, then speaks in a slow, hesitant voice. I remember watching my son learning to ride a bicycle along a street I do not know. The pavement has these dark patches where someone spilled tar. There is a dog with a torn ear lying by a newspaper stand. I am worried he will fall, but he does not. The interviewer notes, subject has no children. When told this later, he becomes annoyed, not confused. You are wrong, he replies. You were not there. I held the back of the saddle. My hand hurt. If this file belonged to a different era, or a different country, you might expect someone to declare the park haunted and fence it off with some folkloric explanation. That is not what happens here. Instead, the KGB decide to treat it as a leak. The dominant theory that emerges in their internal notes is not metaphysical. It is, in its own way, more unsettling. One senior officer phrases it like this: we must consider the possibility that this locality and its underlying structure act as a coupling point between individual memory traces and a shared background of recollections from the surrounding population. Under stress, subjects' memory systems may be resonating with unshielded patterns belonging to others. Translated out of committee language, Perhaps this is a place where the boundary between your own memories and those of others nearby, geographically, historically, physically, thins. Not because of ghosts, but because of some structural quirk in how the environment and the nervous system interact. To test that, they decide to bring real memories into the mix. They compile a set of detailed life histories from volunteers who will never set foot in the park. People from other cities, other provinces, whose stories have no obvious overlap with subjects at the lab. They extract certain key scenes, moments with strong sensory content, like a house fire, a first kiss on a rooftop, a car accident at a crossroads, and encode them as visual and verbal narratives. These borrowed lives are then read aloud underground to selected subjects, accompanied by photographs and sound effects, as if they were film scripts. The subjects are instructed to imagine them as vividly as possible, to rehearse them mentally, to try them on as if they were their own. The point is to see whether park memories are just these implanted stories coming back out. What happens instead complicates the picture. Some of the implanted scenes do indeed reappear in later park episodes, but with alterations that do not match either the subject's own life or the donor's. Details drift. A brother becomes a sister. The color of a car changes. The layout of a room shifts subtly towards something more generic. More interestingly, entirely new scenes appear that match neither original set. When those new scenes are compared across different subjects, they sometimes align with each other, and occasionally, disturbingly, with parts of the donors' lives that were not included in the scripts. A man who was never told about a particular alley behind a factory in another city describes it in detail, down to the crooked street lamp and the oil stain on the wall. Features only the original worker who wrote the life history had mentioned in his initial questionnaire. The donor, when presented with the park subject's description months later, recognizes it instantly and says, "That is the back way we used to take when the foreman was not looking." At that point, the line between test and contamination begins to blur. The file's authors start to flag passages with cautious phrases: possible cross-subject memory resonance, uncontrolled bidirectional transfer, non-local correlation. Underneath, in pencil, someone who has no patience for jargon simply writes, "They are remembering each other. The park is helping." If you are looking for the moment when things tip from unpleasant curiosity into danger in the eyes of the state, it comes with the next step. One of the test subjects, after a particularly intense park episode, refuses to leave. He is not physically violent. He simply sits on bench alpha as dusk falls, watching shadows lengthen. When approached, he says he is waiting for them to come back. Asked who, he answers with a list of names no one recognizes, delivered with the certainty of someone reciting his children's full names at roll call. When guards attempt to escort him away, he panics, not at them, but at the idea of being taken away from where it is all stored. He gestures at the air around the bench as if it were full of shelves. In the underground room later, when calmer, he explains in fragmented phrases that on the bench he knew how the rest of it fits together. Not just my own, he says, but the rest. I could feel where it all goes when people forget it. There is an argument in the margin of that transcript, an exchange of notes between a lab administrator and a KGB analyst. One insists this is schizophrenic ideation. The other points out that the subject shows no other signs of psychosis before or after park exposure, and passes all standard tests for reality orientation. The same subject later demonstrates, under controlled conditions, the ability to answer simple factual questions about the lives of other subjects. Birth dates, number of siblings, former occupations, at rates significantly above chance. He cannot say how he knows. When asked, he says almost apologetically, "It seems obvious when I sit there, like it is printed on the air." This is where the unusual reactions in the monitoring posts turn into something close to fear. The KGB officer in charge writes a longer note than usual. If this effect is real and reproducible, we are in a situation where sensitive individuals may gain access, however partial, to personal histories of others without their consent. This has clear counterintelligence implications. It is also, frankly, destabilizing to any concept of a secure internal life. The polite phrase for that in the rest of the document is privacy breach. The impolite, unstated one is thought crime without effort. After that, the question is no longer whether Memory Park is an anomaly. The question is whether it can be weaponized or whether it is too dangerous to exist at all. They try, briefly, to weaponize it. A separate team, from outside the original lab, arrives with a different set of subjects, interrogators, informants, people already used to extracting and carrying secrets. The plan, laid out in a memo that prefers euphemism, is to see whether Park-assisted recall can improve information yield from interviews. In practice, that means this. A source with half-hearted loyalty is brought to the underground rooms, warmed up with standard questions, then walked up to bench Alpha with an experienced interrogator at his side. They sit. The interrogator asks simple questions, ostensibly about the subject's own life. First job, first theft, first lie to a superior. The hope is that the Park will prompt richer answers, or even leak bits of the subject's associates' lives. There is no record of spectacular results. The Park does not become a magic mirror for spying. Secrets do not spill out wholesale. What is recorded instead is stranger and less useful. The interrogator, after each session, writes more about his own experiences than the subject's. He finds himself overwhelmed by flashes of lives that are neither his nor the subject's. Small, inconsequential scenes of strangers' days. He sees a woman he has never met burning her hand on a stove in a cramped kitchen. A boy in a different town losing a shoe in a muddy field. An old man dropping a glass and watching it roll under a cupboard. These images come with a weight of authenticity that makes them hard to shake, but offer nothing of operational value. "I am being flooded with trivial truths," he complains. "It is like listening at all doors at once and hearing only grocery lists and soft sighs." Even so, over time, the cumulative effect begins to wear him down. He stops sleeping properly. He grows irritated with colleagues, telling one, in an unguarded moment, "I am tired of carrying everyone else's leftovers in my head." He requests reassignment. His request is initially denied. A week later, after he begins mixing up his own memories with others in official reports, it is quietly granted. One of his supervisors makes a note. Zone appears to degrade boundary between self and other, not just for tested subjects, but for personnel in supportive roles. Long-term exposure undesirable. That, more than anything, kills the idea of using Memory Park as a tool. You cannot deploy an asset that unravels the people charged with handling it. The culminating incident, the one that produces the strange shift in final reports mentioned on the cover sheet, takes place not in a lab room or even on the bench, but on an ordinary day when the park is briefly open to the public. This is one of the oddest features of the whole story. For much of its life, Object Memory Park is not, on the surface, objectified. It remains a publicly accessible space in a small, closed settlement. Children play on its swings. Retirees walk its paths. Families picnic under its trees. Only a few paths near the underground entrance are discreetly watched. The experiments are designed to blend into that normality. Subjects in plain clothes are walked among ordinary visitors. Guards dress down. Researchers carry their notebooks in cheap bags instead of folders. The assumption is that whatever the park is doing works better when it is not observed too obviously. One weekend, the date is redacted, but internal cross-references place it in late summer. A minor festival is held near the factory to celebrate some production target. Banners are hung. Loudspeakers play tinny music. Vendors sell sugared pastries from carts. People drift through the park as part of the day, more numerous than usual. At the same time, against better judgment, a limited observation program continues. Lab subjects with prior park experiences are folded into the crowd, wearing plain badges and told to mingle. Monitoring staff, equally disguised, take notes and keep watch for any pronounced episodes. The files from that day are fragmented. Several pages are missing. Others are overwritten with corrections. Still, a shape emerges. At some point in the afternoon, around the time the music from the loudspeakers switches to slower, older songs, multiple people scattered across the park, subjects and ordinary residents, begin to show the same kind of distant, listening expression the experimenters have come to recognize. A woman standing near the playground drops her cone of ice cream and starts weeping quietly, saying, "They've painted the fence yellow," even though the fence in front of her is faded green. A boy on a bicycle stops mid-ride, eyes unfocused, and mutters, "Not this hill again," as if he has climbed it 100 times in some other life. An old man, sitting alone on bench alpha, lifts his hand as if to smoke a cigarette, then frowns when he realizes he does not have one, whispering, "She quit last year. Why is she back?" None of these people are part of any scheduled session. Observers rush to make notes, to separate the in-program from the spontaneous. At first, it is manageable. Isolated incidents scattered. Then, for a short period, no more than a few minutes by the estimates of those present, the park falls eerily quiet. The musicians falter. A group of teenagers in the far corner stop wrestling and just stand, as if listening for a cue. A child's wail dies mid-cry. Later, several witnesses use the same odd phrase to describe this. It was like everyone's eyes went inward at once. The monitoring posts, which usually show only mild physiological changes, record simultaneous spikes in heart rate and galvanic skin response across a wide sample of people, not just test subjects. It is as if the entire park had touched an electric fence that did not exist. No one screams, no one collapses. Instead, there's a collective inhale, a pause, and then movement resumes as if nothing has happened. The music comes back up. Children laugh. People continue their conversations, some looking muddled, others apparently untouched. The fading signal linked to visitors' reports in the log is represented by a brief surge in the number of spontaneous recollection episodes recorded that day, followed by a sharp drop in reports of normal autobiographical memory. In the hours and days after the festival, people visiting the clinic in the settlement complain not that they are remembering strange things, but that they cannot quite place familiar ones. "I know I am married," one woman tells the doctor, "and I recognize my husband's face. But when I think back to our wedding day, all I see is other people's kitchens." Other people's kitchens becomes a phrase that recurs in a dozen variants. Other people's stairwells, other people's courtyards, other people's arguments at midnight. The sense that one's personal anchor points have been diluted into a crowd. The KGB debrief of this day is heavily censored, but a few lines remain. "We may have crossed a threshold," the officer writes. "Previously, we observed individual subjects dipping into others' recollections or shared local scenes. The festival event suggests a momentary synchronization of many minds, overwhelming usual boundaries between self and other. The overall effect, afterwards, is not increased access to secrets, but a generalized weakening of individual narrative continuity," he adds in a sentence that survives only partially. "A population whose citizens cannot be sure which memories are theirs is difficult to govern, but also difficult to mobilize. That is the point where the calculus shifts decisively towards containment. Whatever memory park is doing, it is not producing reliable tools. It is eroding something the state quietly depends on. The idea that each person's inner life is a ledger that can be balanced and audited when necessary. The cover-up that follows is clumsy in places and meticulous in others. On the infrastructural level, the park remains, but it is gradually neglected. Benches rot and are not replaced. The monument is declared unsafe and fenced off. Rumors spread, encouraged by small, careful nudges, that the place is unhealthy. A minor contamination incident at the nearby factory is blamed and chained to the park in whispered stories. Parents are quietly told to take their children elsewhere. Over a few years, Memory Park becomes less crowded, easier to patrol, less entangled with everyday life. The underground rooms are reclassified, then reassigned. Officially, they now house a storage area for meteorological equipment, then a civil defense training facility, then nothing at all. Access tunnels are walled. Bench Alpha is removed entirely one autumn under the pretext of repairing a drainage problem. The worker who wrote about its perpetual warmth is transferred to another district. On the archival level, recollection logs are altered. Park columns are merged back into life histories or discarded. References to Object Memory Park are replaced with more generic language: site, locality, field A. Pages with particularly unsettling comparative tables, where lives overlap too neatly, are torn out and marked as removed due to duplication error. It never quite works. You can hide reports, but you cannot easily erase the lines they have already drawn in the minds of the people who wrote and read them. Near the back of the file, after the last formal assessment, which concludes blandly that no verifiable evidence exists for non-conventional transfer of autobiographical information, there are a few handwritten additions that have survived by clinging to the inside of the cover. One is in a crooked, hurried script, perhaps added years later by someone sneaking a last word into a closed story. "I was on duty at the park after they closed the benches," it reads. "We were told to keep people out, but there were not many who wanted to come by then. On one of these nights, I walked the path alone and sat where Bench Alpha used to be. I did not see visions. I did not hear voices. I only had a simple, stubborn thought. I miss remembering myself without doubt. And then, clear as a photograph, I saw a woman sitting there in summer light, crying over a letter I have never read. I knew her name, but I cannot write it now, because I do not know if it was hers or mine. Another note, in a different hand, is shorter. Burning this file will not burn the things it describes, it says. At best, it will make us the only ones who cannot check whether what we remember is true. The last surviving official line, typed and stamped, says simply, "Object Memory Park closed. Monitoring concluded. No further reports." You can take that at face value if you like. It is comforting to believe anomalies end when we tell them to. Standing in a brightly lit archive room decades later, it is easy to reduce Memory Park to a collection of confusions. Stressed subjects, suggestible minds, a few overlapping details that could be coincidence dressed as meaning. The rational story is there for the taking. And yet there is something about the way these people describe not just singular strange episodes, but the texture of their days afterward, that is harder to explain away. They do not simply say they saw foreign scenes. They say their own lives felt thinner afterwards, as if some of the weight that made their memories theirs had drained into the ground under those trees. You do not need ghosts or telepathy for that to be disturbing. All you need is the idea that there might be places, accidental, unplanned, where the usual insulation between your experience and everyone else's wears through. Maybe Memory Park was nothing more than a laboratory accident married to suggestible minds and a bench that happened to sit over some conductive structure, electrical or psychological or both. Maybe it was the product of a particular culture at a particular time, heavy with stories people were not allowed to tell, finding a crack in the pavement. Or maybe, as one of the more imaginative analysts put it in a note that was never meant to leave this folder, we stumbled onto a patch of ground where forgetting runs off like rainwater, and for a while the overflow soaked whoever stood there long enough. Object Memory Park exists now only as a name on a fading file, and a handful of odd local legends in a town whose young people no longer believe much of what their grandparents say. The benches have been replaced or removed. The monument is a lump of concrete with no plaque. Children walk their own paths through what is left of the trees, carrying phones full of other people's pictures, instead of sitting still long enough to listen for other lives. But if you ever find yourself in a place that was once part of a system like this, an ordinary strip of green behind a factory, a park that feels older than the apartment blocks around it, it would not be entirely irrational to notice how you feel after you leave. Whether the memories that rise in you on the bus ride home fit neatly into your own chronology, or whether they carry the faint smell of a bakery you have never visited, the echo of a language you never learned. If they do, you can dismiss it as imagination, as contamination from films, as the mind playing tricks. That is the safe choice, and it is usually right, or you can consider briefly that somewhere under your feet there might have been a bench once that never quite cooled down, and a group of tired people taking notes on the fact that for a handful of years, in one small place, the private lives of strangers were not as private as anyone liked to think, and that the only evidence left of that is a file someone tried very hard to make boring and failed. And if, years from now, you catch yourself defending a memory you cannot source, arguing for the reality of a scene no one else remembers, you might think of this forgotten park and wonder, just for a second, whose life brushed against yours without either of you noticing.